thing I'd like to tell you is that you may get out of this room and have learned something, but it's not a really, really serious talk, so feel free to laugh if you feel like. And I'm going to tell you about obfuscation, golfing, and secret operators in Perl. So let's start with obfuscation. When you talk about obfuscation, some people think, how do I impress my friends who don't know much Perl with obfuscation? And you would think with something really, really tricky. Wrong. What you want to do is you want to use something simple, something that they won't understand, but that if you try to explain it, they will understand it. So, for instance, this is really, really simple. It's just a ternary operator, and you're printing just another Perl hacker. But most people will look at it and say, why are you exiting and exiting? But I found out that it gets even better if you try to use something that they think they understand, but they really don't. For instance, everybody knows what pipe stands for. It stands for do this, and if you fail in doing it, do that. So they're going to look at it, and they're going to say, oh, I know what you're doing now. You're trying to exit, and if you fail on exiting, it doesn't make any sense at all. So, things you can do to obfuscate your code. First of all, forget about spaces. But just because you're forgetting about spaces doesn't mean you should forget about new lines. You should use new lines. In fact, you should use as many as you can. And you should forget about indentation, or if you're really going to use indentation, at least use it wrongly. If you're going to use semicolons, then you should also use it wrongly, in the wrong places. And if you're going to use semicolons, you can use a lot of them. And there are alternatives to semicolons. So all of these words work depending on what's on $A and $B. And you should use things indirectly. For instance, you can store things in $_ and then use it without ever naming it. And you can bend the rules. Just because substitution and transliteration is written like that doesn't mean you can write it like this. And there are a bunch of things that you can use, and even if you don't need them, maybe you should. For instance, an extra semicolon or an empty block. And then you can start mixing things together. Lots of them. So in this case, we have a ternary operator, and we're also using the colon for the substitution operator. Is that code? No, that's not code. And is that a comment? No, that's not a comment. Now, for instance, if we want to print out just another Perl hacker, maybe we can do something like this. So the substitution is now kind of disguised as the S switch for the previous substitution. So if we do something like this, we may be able to fool a few people, and then with something like this now actually prints just another Perl hacker, because it's removing the we want to, and it's evaluating all the rest. Are those brackets closed? They are, but not in the beginning. And what you see is not always what you get. You see, that prints 42, and it's all digits. There's an X there, but it's 42. For instance, there are no underscores in that first value. There is no E in that second one. There is an E in all those sixes. There's a plus in that fourth value, and there is no dot in 0.0. Use hexadecimal and so on. And when it comes to variable names, these do just fine. And behold, did you know that it always works like this? You can add as many spaces as you want there. And so now that you're talking about variable names, you can start mixing them up with other things cleverly. And you can also calculate variable names. For instance, that's actually $2. Or you can store the variable name somewhere else. And you can try to use some special variables. For instance, if you store another Perl inside the record separator, not the record separator, $comma. And you can also go behind human capabilities. For instance, if I give you a sentence, and if I apply that transliteration, will you be able to tell me from the top of your mind what's going to come out? And you should use the most uncommon things, like this, because most programmers don't use this every single day, so they're really not aware of what it does. Subroutines. If you name your subroutine something clever, then you can do clever things with them. Or if you don't name them at all, and you can start being inventive. Like, for instance, substituting a new line and replacing it with nothing. In fact, you can be very inventive. So suppose you're going, for instance, to do this globally. What, you just put a G over there, right? No, you can put more than one. And now for an example. We want to print just another Perl hacker. So maybe we'll just split things up and let's put the space somewhere else. Like this. And now let's reverse the list. And let's get rid of all those spaces over there. And now let's say that instead of printing the reversed list, we're going to store it somewhere else, and we're going to print it in the end. And after that, we might just get rid of that space and use a special variable that already has a space. And if we say we want it to be a positive value, that's okay. In fact, it's okay for the first variable too. Let's just join things up there and use $_. And instead of doing something, why not substituting nothing for it and then evaluating it? And if you're evaluating it, why not putting inside a string and then evaluating it again? And since it's inside the string, so now caret underscore is just too well known, so let's forget about it. And if you're printing $_, you don't really have to say it. So now, let's use those separators for the first part of the substitution, and let's use semicolons for the second part. And now let's put the print inside what we're going to do, and let's evaluate it afterwards. But if we're going to evaluate it afterwards, maybe we can just put another E there. So, talking about hexadecimal and such, let's just do this, and let's put things over there inside brackets. It's okay if you try to concatenate things that aren't really strings, because Perl is going to evaluate all of it. And now you are about to see the most brilliant trick that obfuscation has to offer you. You see, most people think that this is just a comment. Now, the thing is, it is a comment, but since it says right there it's a comment, no one is going to believe you. Now, a word of caution. Don't you ever, ever, ever run obfuscated code that you don't know where it came from or what it does. And I'm going to give you an example. A couple of years ago, the guy in Slashdot had this on his signature. Can you figure out what it does? So, a few people that were really curious decided to try it out. Not recommended. Let's see, so there's a ternary operator over there. So we're looking for columns. There's a substitution over there. That's why we're looking for... No, let's get back. So, there's a ternary operator. Right after it, there's a substitution. So that column cannot be the one from the ternary operator. Now, if we're looking for the rest of the substitution, it stops right there. Now, since $? Is false in the beginning, we can just forget about all this because it's not going to happen. So, what's really happening is that we're substituting nothing with that garbage over there. Afterwards, we are transliterating it. See what I told you about going behind human capabilities? So there was garbage before, and now there's something that I have no idea what it is. And what are we going to do next is we're just going to run that code. We have no idea what it is, and we're going to run it. So what's on $_ after all? So after a couple of hours, people were finally being able to tell, don't do it. Because I did, and it took me this much time to get back to you again. So let's talk about golfing. Golfing, if obfuscation is the art of coding in such a way that no one will understand your code, well, golfing is the art of performing a task in the least amount of characters possible. So you're just going to use one-carat variables, for instance. And if you don't need something, you're not going to use it, like a space or a semicolon. You're going to forget about \n, because that takes up 2 characters, and if you actually type enter, that's just 1 character. If you end in the beginning, you might say 1 character, because you don't need a semicolon. You should learn your alternatives. Just because you find the map with the block on the documentation doesn't mean you can do it another way around. And speaking of doing things the other way around, you can also use the for cycle the other way around. Now, switches are something that come really, really handy when you're talking about golfing. Special variables too. And then there are a bunch of golfing techniques. Like, for instance, this one. So, what does this do? The thing is, if $_ has a space inside it, or rather, if $_ doesn't have a space inside it, it's going to be empty. Because you're trying to match, and if I remember correctly, then you're putting on $_ the number of times as spaces it has in it. Another technique, for instance, also known as the Abigail's length horror. This will actually tell you how many characters are in a string. Secret operators. The secret Eskimo greeting. This actually works. Like this. So, what does that do? Notice the end switch. If you go to the documentation for the end switch, you can see that it actually puts a while loop around all your code. So what happens is that your code goes inside that. And now you have just found a better way to perform an AND block. The supermarket trolley. So what you're doing here is you're creating a reference to an array, and then you're dereferencing it again. Nothing special about it, but the thing is, if you use it inside a string, you can actually put code inside a string. So instead of doing something outside the string and then using the variable inside it, you can do it the first time around. The Goatsy operator. Because it forces list context, it can be really, really handy. In this case, we're trying to see how many spaces are in that first variable. The inchworm on a stick. So what does this do? You'll notice that we get that variable $x, and what's going to happen is this. So basically it's a high precedence decrement, or a high precedence increment if $x is lower than 0. For the next one, I couldn't come up with a name. I'm open to suggestions. The triple slash. Okay.
Adidas.
What?
The Adidas. Das
Okay. So what does this do, for instance? You would think that this wouldn't even compile, but actually, double slash is a match of nothing, so it returns 1. If you divide 1 by 4, it returns 0.25. So if you do this, it actually prints out 0.25. The inchworm. So what does that do? By negating 2 times, you get the whatever you had in the beginning, but the thing is that you are now forcing scalar context. So instead of getting something like that, you can now get something like this. The min-max operator. So what does this do? This actually gets you the lesser of $x and $y. Because you're creating a list, and then you're accessing the first or the second value, depending on which one is bigger. You can also use it this way, by swapping $x and $y on the second-hand part, and then you get the greater of $x and $y. And there's all sorts of tricks like this. A couple of examples. Irreduce camel code. The funny thing about this is so when you run this code, it's going to read itself, resize itself, and print itself out in 4 different ways. For some reason, I am not. That's more like it. Next up, Saturn. So, what this does it, it takes you to Saturn. I can't explain this part. Unfortunately, it takes us back again. So, what else we have there? Okay, Space Invaders. Apart from looking like a Space Invader, this is actually the game Space Invaders. So, you're going to have to take my word for it, but I actually killed 5 Space Invaders. Unfortunately, computers today are so fast that you can no longer play this game. One of my favorites, years ago, a French guy he made an entry for the obfuscation pro contest, and what it did was this. So the thing is, that piece of code is both valid Perl and valid PostScript. If you run it, now this was, I believe, being sponsored by the Perl Journal, so if you run this code, you'll get this. But the most wonderful thing about it is that if you open it with the PostScript viewer, you'll get this. And if you zoom in, you'll notice that it actually says the Perl Journal everywhere. If memory doesn't fail me, I believe it didn't get the first entry because it was above the character limit. I don't recall exactly, but I think that was it. Back in the days of the Roman Empire, apparently there was already Perl. So if you run this, it actually prints just another Perl hacker. So it's not only about the tricks, it's also about the form, the look. And before getting to that terminal, I had a pretty good idea of how much time I had been speaking for, but now I don't anymore because this is again a 0. The C also. So there are 2 very good things that you can read. One is The Art of Obfuscation by Thomas Klausner, in which he explains several different parts of the obfuscation world. Right? The JAP, that's just one of it. You have to do something that prints out just another Perl hacker. But there are several ones. Like for instance, that there used to be a contest in Paris to see how many ways one could come up of increasing the variable $A. I believe they got to 70-something different ways. The paper, How to Write Unmaintainable Code by Rody Green, is a wonderful paper because it explains things in a psychological way. Like for instance, if you're trying to add 2 variables like $chair and $table, it's easy for us to understand that. But if you try to add things like abstract concepts like $love and $friendship, it gets really, really complicated. So you can start messing up with people like that. So these are two things that I really advise you to read. A word of caution. I'm always getting emails from people asking me about good Perl obfuscators so that they can obfuscate and therefore protect their code. It doesn't work like that. When you obfuscate code, I think this is wonderful from an educated perspective, because the more you do these kind of things, the more you learn about the language. But if you're starting to obfuscate your Perl code, or any other code for that matter, just so you can protect your code, that's not going to work. You'll be better off compiling your code, because there are several ways of de-obfuscating it. And plus, if you obfuscate your code, you're just giving someone a challenge, and you all know when you give a challenge to a geek. So that's not going to work. And I believe there was something else I wanted to tell you, which I should have written in the slide, because now I don't remember anymore. Automatic obfuscators, and I guess that was probably it. So, any questions, any comments, any suggestions? Anyone in need of an ambulance? No? Well, I think I'm ahead of time, but... Oh,
You've still got like 10 minutes.
okay.
What are some good techniques for deobfuscation?
Some good techniques for deobfuscation. Well, first of all, I gotta mention that there are a couple of models that can really help. If the code hasn't been really, really obfuscated, you can probably do something like Perl tidy, and that will take care of everything. But most of the time, Perl tidy won't be able to deobfuscate the code, so then you have things like BD parse, for instance, that will kind of convert the code to what Perl sees, and that will be really, really helpful. Not using tools, I would advise you to try to break it into things, into small chunks that you can understand. It's not always going to work. It depends on how good your Perl is and how creative you can be, because sometimes, for instance, you try to separate the chunks and they don't work anymore because, say, for instance, the code is reading itself, and it depends on that.
So, quick follow-up. So when you use stuff like BD parse, it just sort of simplifies the bracketing and some of the alignment a little bit, because you have like a string that's actually written in hex that goes through.
Yeah, right. Yeah. BD parse won't do everything for you. Anyone else? Liam?
What are you going to do next?
What am I going to do next? Next I'm going to be thankful that I finished this talk, because yeah, I came from Portugal. It was like a 16-hour flight. I came here with no slides, and I just showed you 147 slides. So next time I'm just going to be really, really happy, and I'm going to prepare my talk for tomorrow. Anyone else? If not, well, just thank you.